Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. So it seems in the past 50 years, there's been this obsession in America and probably in other Western countries with authenticity, right? Our goal in life should be to uncover or discover our authentic selves. And once we do that, the universe will unfold before us. Relationships will be awesome. We'll work with passion. We'll make money, and our family will be awesome. And it's just everything will be great. In fact, you can buy books that'll help you uncover your authentic self. You can hire a life coach that'll help you discover your authentic self. You can take courses on living authentic manhood. I've seen that around. And marketers, businesses have gotten hold of this obsession with authenticity that we have. And now you can buy authentic artisanal pizza from Domino's, or you can buy a candle made by an authentic craftsman in a New England hamlet. And because we're drawn to that, we'll buy it because it says authentic. But what if this drive, this obsession with authenticity is actually hamstringing us from living a truly flourishing life? Well, that's the argument my guest today made in his latest book. His name is Eric Wilson. He's a professor at Wake Forest University. He's one of the leading experts on the connection between psychology and literature. He's a scholar of romanticism. It's a big R romanticism. And in his book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life, he makes the subtle but powerful argument that instead of trying to uncover some platonic authentic self, that what we should really be doing is trying to create ourself, an authentic self. And then sometimes that's going to feel fake, but that's okay. So today on the podcast, Eric and I discuss how you create an authentic life and what we can learn from philosophy, from science, from literature, from art, from films, from actors, particularly actors like Bill Murray or Cary Grant, about creating an authentic life. A really fascinating discussion. If you love philosophy and art and neuroscience and psychology and literature like I do, and like how those interconnect, you're going to love our discussion. So without further ado, Eric Wilson, Keep It Fake. Eric Wilson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so your latest book is called Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life. And I think it's kind of funny you called it Inventing an Authentic Life, because we usually don't think of authenticity that way. And I love this book because it hits a topic that I've been thinking a lot about the past few years, and this idea of authenticity. Because it's become it's an article of faith in America that you have to be authentic, right? Everyone's trying to be authentic. There's psychologists, therapists, gurus who help you find and discover your authentic self. Corporations are kind of using authenticity as a way to market their wares. So we have artisanal pizza from Domino's that looks rustic, and I guess it's authentic. And it's one of those words I think we use so much that we take it for granted, and we often don't think about what does authenticity mean. So how do you define authenticity?
Well, I can talk about how I think that mainstream America defines it.
That'd be great.
I can talk about how I define it. So you refer to how authenticity is often used in marketing. For instance, Domino's can say, we have an authentic pizza. It's an artisanal pizza. I think that authenticity in the mainstream is a kind of naive belief that there's some rock-solid reality that goes beyond societal convention, that goes beyond how we talk about the world, a kind of isness, a kind of being, a kind of essence. And if we can just get in touch with that, we'll be okay. And, this idea is expressed often by the idea that you can be yourself or you can find yourself, as if there's some sort of, essential Ericness or essential Brettness sort of, underlying all the developments of your life, all the circumstances of your life, the history of your life. And I think that idea is carried over to, our desire to have local food or organic food, the idea that there's a kind of deep realness to that escapes artifice. I think this is just kind of Platonism in reverse, right? If you go back to read Plato, he said that there's some sort of ideal realm of forms in some eternal realm somewhere, and each of us is a particular manifestation of these forms. And the goal in life is to sort of find how we relate to these stable forms, and then we'll be in line with truth, beauty, and goodness. Well, now we've kind of sunk that down into this idea of organicity, right? that, if I can just sort of go down deeply enough into existence, there it will be realness. What I say is that there's no such thing as a self like this. Basically, existence is too ephemeral, too transient for there to be any sort of stable being. I know for myself, my parents told me, be yourself, find yourself. Well, maybe I'm just too wishy-washy, or maybe I just lack fortitude. I can't stay the course. But it's always seemed frustrating to me to try to find some stable idea of identity when I'm constantly changing. So in my book, I explore the idea that a more powerful and useful form of authenticity, a less frustrating form of authenticity, is to think about authenticity as something that's not found, but something that is made. And what I mean is, for me, it's been very empowering to think about myself as a kind of way of interpreting my life as it is at a given moment. So when I'm in college, I'm going to think of myself one way because I have certain circumstances. When I'm a father, I'm going to think of myself another way because I have different circumstances. So what I try to do is I try to create a kind of narrative that helps me make sense of the chaos of my life. And I sort of imagine myself as a character in that narrative, sort of a character in a novel. So, for instance, if I said to you, Brett, who are you? You would probably immediately start thinking about moments in your past that were especially meaningful to you. Oh, when I was 6, this happened to me, and when I was 8, that happened to me, and that led to this happening to me when I'm 12. In other words, you would try to kind of create these causal links among various moments in your life, and that would allow you to create a kind of cogent story that will lead up to who you are at that moment in the present. Well, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, as your present circumstances change, you might focus on different memories, right? You might emphasize other memories and de-emphasize the memories that you earlier valued and come up with a kind of fresh narrative. So what I'm suggesting is that we're constantly, whether we want to or not, inventing fresh narratives to make sense of the kind of the flux of experience. And there are a lot of neuroscientists recently who have actually talked about how that's how cognition itself works. What I say in the book is, why don't we just become self-conscious about this? Why don't we become aware of the fact that we're making narratives and sort of take charge of our narratives and try to create a narrative that will make our life as rich and full and varied as possible, and then sort of take responsibility for that narrative. To me, that's what authenticity properly should be.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. So I guess is the reason why people are so drawn to a Platonic ideal of authenticity is that maybe it's just it's hard to manage complexity in an ever-changing flux life? Is that what's going on? Is that why there's that drive?
Well, I would say so. If I were to account for it psychologically, I would say that it's very seductive to imagine there is such a thing as permanent truth. I mean, life is insecure. It's unpredictable, and that leads to pain and frustration very frequently. So it's nice to think that if I could just find that one truth, that one identity, then I could rest. I could find calm. I could find peace. I could find tranquility. I understand the desire for that. I mean, I still have that desire. I mean, I would love to be able to say, this is who I am, my work is done. Because it's hard work, as you're suggesting, to sort of honestly face the complexity of life and try to come up with a way of thinking about yourself which is sensitive to that complexity, that allows you to organize that complexity in a way that doesn't sort of kill it and reduce it, but also doesn't allow the complexity to overwhelm you at the same time.
All right, so your book, Keep It Fake, the format is a lot different from some of the other books I've read because it's a mixture of whole things. You get into philosophy, literature, you bring in Bill Murray, you bring in your own life. What was your organizing principle with the book?
Well, I would call it a hybrid book. It is kind of all over the place, but I hope in a good way, right? So one part of the book is I interweave stories of my own life. My life as a phony, as someone who has been a fake in good ways and bad ways, and that's really, I think, the backbone of the book. But also there are a lot of philosophical sections, scientific sections, psychological sections, literary sections, and also just a lot of sort of playful riffs on, say, Bill Murray or Cary Grant. I really wanted the book to have a kind of playfulness to it, like a kind of multiplicity, because that's the kind of persona I would want to create, one that has that kind of heterogeneity and playfulness to it. So that's really kind of what I tried to capture in the book. And I guess my models would be sort of playful philosophers, not that I would compare myself in any way to these folks, but someone like a Montaigne, or even a Thoreau, would be a model for this. So I hope people get into the playfulness of the book.
Yeah, for sure. It was a lot of fun to read. I mean, that was the thing I wanted to keep reading because it was just so much fun. So in your book, you refer to a lot of philosophers, writers who grappled with this question, and they might not have called it authenticity, but it was the same idea of what is the self? Is it possible to be yourself? I mean, how did philosophers in the past deal with this question of selfhood?
Well, the idea that there's sort of a single individual, unique self, unrepeatable, unprecedented, and it will never be again, I think really didn't come into being until probably the 15th century, when the French philosopher Montaigne started writing his essays, and his basic question was, "Who am I?" So he was writing, basically about the very idiosyncratic, weird things that make him who he is, and no one else. I'm going to generalize kind of wildly here,
Sure.
but roughly, before that. And again, Montaigne was actually writing in the 16th century. I think I said 15th before 16th century. You go back to someone like Plato, and I think there's a sense that each of us is not a sort of discrete individual, but one expression of some sort of universal ground of being. In Plato's case, it's the forms. You can go to Christianity. I mean, there is an idea that each of us has an individual soul, but the individual soul is most fully itself when it expresses the kind of Christ within it that all of us share. And I could talk about medieval theologians, and I could talk about someone like Descartes. All of whom do kind of suggest that, ultimately who we are is a manifestation of some sort of, universal being or power or substance. But then Montaigne comes along and says, no, there is such a thing as an unrepeatable being. I am that, and no one will ever be like me again. And you kind of see that idea played out in someone like Shakespeare, who was a deep reader of Montaigne. And in fact, he was reading Montaigne very deeply when he wrote Hamlet. And some would see Hamlet as the first literary work in the West, anyway, that treats this idea that there is no one like Hamlet, and there will never be anyone again like him. And the same is true of all of us. And this kind of idea becomes a ground for, I'd say, a mid to late 19th century philosophical turn, embodied by people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard, who were really the first to say, in a kind of disciplined philosophical sense. And Montaigne was a kind of literary essayist. Shakespeare was obviously a dramatist. These weren't philosophers. But Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, in a kind of philosophical sense, wanted to say that the place to start with philosophy is which is raw existence, the kind of nowness, the kind of messiness of where we are right here, right now. And life is messy, it's unpredictable, it is weird, it's strange, and to try to reduce that to some sort of logic or rationality is wrong from the start, and kind of blinding oneself to what reality is. And this becomes the basis for what became known in the 20th century as existentialism, right? Which is precisely this idea that the place to start for philosophy, for literature, for art, really for anything, is precisely, the sort of single, isolated individual self and how he or she makes sense of his or her own personal world. Now, again, those are kind of large, sweeping philosophical claims, but I think that kind of gives the shape of, how the idea of, self has kind of loosely evolved in the history of philosophy.
Okay. So if we're all just, if it's not possible to discover your authentic self, right? And we're all just acting in a way. And I'm saying that in a positive way. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable. Yeah, why is that? I mean, yeah, people are uncomfortable with this idea that you are putting on a performance in a way, not only for other people, but for yourself in a weird way. Isn't that not right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it shows up in our politics, right? I mean, if we talk about Tricky Dick and Slick Willie, the best way to sort of throw a politician to disrepute is to say, well, that person's a liar. You look at our sort of American cinema icons. You think of someone like John Wayne, Gary Cooper, Gregory Peck. It's all about shooting straight, being sincere, telling it like it is. So we value that idea, and when we think someone is being dissimulating or play acting, we often think that's hypocrisy. And so what I try to say in my book is there are degrees of play acting, right? So let's say that identity is something we make that we don't find. Let's say that the idea of self is a kind of ongoing narrative. Well, does that mean that I can be anything that I want to? And does that mean that I should be able to lie and it's okay? I say absolutely not in my book. All fictions are not created equally. Paradoxically, what I say is that some fictions are truer than others. What do I mean by that? So if you think of the self as a narrative, as a novel, you can start thinking, well, some novels are better than others. What makes a novel good? What makes a novel not so good? Well, one way to think about a really powerful novel is a narrative that is open to complexity, that is able to connect with as many different points of view as possible. In other words, to create a sense of self that is open to the otherness of the world and tries to accommodate the otherness of the world, as opposed to a narrative that closes you down, that basically says, okay, I have sort of one way of thinking about the world, and I'm going to stay connected to that one way of thinking about the world. Well, that can lead to isolation. So to create a narrative that is narrow, dogmatic, fanatical, and also to sort of go through life lying, to go through life trying to deceive people to gain power over them. These are disempowering narratives, I would say, because they lead to isolation, they lead to alienation, and ultimately, I would say they lead to unhappiness. Whereas creating narratives that are kind of close to the reality of your particular present tend to be those that are the most satisfying. I mean, look, things happen. I have a certain genetic makeup that makes me who I am. Certain things in my past, my parents, my teachers made me who I am. I can't change those things. So there is such a thing as reality. I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as reality, but what I'm saying is that reality only becomes meaningful to us when we start talking about it and interpreting it, putting it into language. And at that point, what reality is not some kind of stable isness, but it's our understanding of it. Let me give you a kind of metaphor for that. So imagine that existence is like being thrown off a cliff into an ocean, right? So I'm being thrown off the cliff into an ocean. Gravity pushes me down to the water in the same way that my past pushes me towards certain actions in the present and the future. I'm being forced down into the water by gravity. Well, what can I do? Well, I have choices, right? I can flail wildly into a belly flop, or I can do a nice swan dive or a jackknife or a gainer. In other words, we're given a certain facts that we can't change, but we can choose how to react to them and choose how to interpret them. And that's where imagination comes in. We can imagine our falling, as it were, or imagine our lives in such a way that they have a kind of beauty and grace and generosity. And those fictions are truer, I argue, than a kind of interpretation or reaction that is closed and narrow and strained.
You mentioned a type of irony I've never heard of before until I read your book. It was called romantic irony. Can that help? Well, first, explain what that is, and can this help us navigate a world where most people say, well, no, you can't, embracing enriching fictitious truths, right? That's kind of weird. You got to stick to the facts. Can romantic irony help you navigate a world like that?
Well, I think so. So romantic irony has a fairly specialized definition. I mean, if you study literature, you know that there are many different kinds of irony, right? There's dramatic irony, which occurs when the audience watching a play knows something that characters don't know. Or there's dramatic irony. Verbal irony, where an author is saying something that has more than one meaning, like when Jane Austen opens up Pride and Prejudice, and I'm paraphrasing, by saying that it's a well-known fact that every man of good fortune is in want of a wife. That's the kind of grammatical meaning. The rhetorical meaning is that women want to marry wealthy men, right? And so those are just many kinds of irony. Romantic irony it really is developed in the late 18th and early 19th century by two writers in Germany, the Schlegel brothers, and it gets developed in England by people like Byron, and in America by people like Melville. And basically, the basic assumption of romantic irony is this: the world is simply too complicated, too abundant, too vast for any one interpretation of it to be accurate, right? So Christianity, say, Marxism, say, Platonism, say, any worldview only tells part of the truth because the world's just too big, it's too complicated, it's too vast. So if I'm a romantic ironist, I acknowledge this and I embrace it, and I don't see it as something that makes me depressed, this constant gap between what I say about the world and what the world really is, but it becomes an invitation to be creative. It becomes a kind of occasion to be exuberant. Think of it this way. So if we go on a field trip, say, to Greece, and we go to a ruined temple, and I say, look at that column from that ruined temple. Can you imagine what the temple actually looked like when it was whole? Well, what do we start doing? We start imagining what this temple would look like, but because the temple's not there, our imagining never stops, right? We can endlessly imagine what this temple might have looked like because we can never actually know what it looked like. Well, some might say, oh, that's really frustrating. but if you're kind of a practitioner of romantic irony, you would say, well, that's really exciting because my mind is constantly activated. It's constantly moving. It's constantly in action, and that leads to a kind of vitality. So this idea is really exciting to me. I mean, and it shows up in works of literature, like when you have a self-conscious narrator who, while telling the story, will kind of stop to say, oh, I'm telling you a story, which kind of highlights that this is a fiction, that it's not real. We see this in film sometime, too, where a character starts talking to the camera. To apply this to life is basically, again, to say that any understanding of the world is only one narrative among many possible narratives, only one interpretation among many possible interpretations. Now, again, this doesn't lead to relativism. There are some interpretations, some narratives which are better than others. And what are those that are better than others? Those that are more aesthetically powerful. Some narratives are more aesthetically powerful than others. They approach the quality of art more so than others. Again, if you think of art as a kind of very complicated system that can bring together a lot of diverse points of view into some sort of basic harmony that is pleasing and graceful. So that's the basic idea of romantic irony, and it's also how one can think about romantic irony in relation not only to literature, but also in relation to one's own life. I mean, look, the way to think of it is no matter what you do, you're an artist. If you're a gardener, if you're a banker, if you're a professor, no matter what you do, that becomes an art form if you think of life in this way. And if you try to see that as a work of art, then I think it makes life more interesting and more exciting and ultimately more beautiful.
This we did a series not too long ago about the philosophy of Nietzsche, and this sounds very Nietzschean.
Yes.
What you're telling me, in existential.
It is. It's absolutely. I mean, what I've just said, you could translate into Nietzsche fairly easily.
Yeah.
I mean, Nietzsche never really used the term romantic irony, but he did talk about an aesthetic understanding of the world, right? The idea being that we are always interpreting, and what we formerly thought of as truth is really just an army of metaphors. And for Nietzsche, we should see this as an invitation to create. For him, the philosopher practices the joyous wisdom, right? The gay science, which is just constantly creating sort of new narratives and new interpretations which hopefully open up the eyes of other people and encourage them to create their own sort of interpretations, that we all become artists, that the greatest philosophers are the greatest artists. That all shows up in Nietzsche.
So I love this idea that we are actors, also screenwriters in our own movie. I think there's a podcast. I think Joe Rogan says that. He's a podcaster. He says that you are the star of your own movie. What would it be? And I thought I like that analogy because I've read this biography about John Wayne, never really knew much about him. I mean, I watched his movies, but when I read the biography, I kind of like got to like the guy a lot more. I was endeared to him. And what endeared to me about him was this idea that through the character of John Wayne, he became a better man. Like he created this character that he himself tried to become, like a fictitious character. More recently, Tom Hardy, the guy who played Bane in the Batman movie, he always plays these like really tough, manly dudes. He even said that like his characters, in the process of embodying this fictitious character, like he himself feels like he is becoming like that person in a way. Can actors, like movie actors, teach us something about being the writers of our own narrative? I mean, were they aware of that? I mean, were they aware of like what you're talking about in a way?
I learned a lot from Cary Grant, and I write about this at length in the book. Cary Grant was very much aware of this. Now, of course, he created Cary Grant as a persona in his own life. He was born Archie Leach, in a very impoverished youth in England, and somehow by hook or by crook, he eventually made his way to the United States, and he created this persona, Cary Grant, and he lived into it. And he had some really interesting quotes. He says, everybody wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant. And he also said, learning to play yourself is the most difficult thing in life that you'll do. But there's a real sense in Grant in these quotes, but also in his acting, that sort of creating a very lively, interesting persona and living into that can give your life a kind of value and vitality you wouldn't have if you had not done that. Now, I'm especially enamored of Grant because, to me, his acting is always unexpected and unpredictable. He never kind of becomes a cliche of himself, I don't think. You go see a Cary Grant movie, you don't care about the plot. It's a Cary Grant movie. Same with John Wayne, right? It's a John Wayne movie. You go see these guys to be those guys, just as you might see, go see Audrey Hepburn or Katharine Hepburn to be those women. This is kind of a classic Hollywood model. Whereas now we often think that good acting is the ability to transform into something totally other than yourself. Like, I'm going to lose a lot of weight or I'm going to get an accent. And back with classic Hollywood, let's create a persona and make it endlessly interesting. And, to me, Grant is endlessly interesting because he's always doing double takes and always, gazing here or there. And in other words, his characters show that he's very much aware of the fact that he is acting. So to me, that's kind of an example for how one might live one's life, just knowing that one is making a script and being aware of that. And I think that Bill Murray does the same thing in a lot of his films, and I write about him in the book as well. That kind of knowingness that he brings to life his characters. So I value them more than, say, John Wayne, even though I've kind of grown to like John Wayne too. I feel like the character he created, to me, isn't as lively and interesting. It's a little more static and predictable than the Grant character or the Murray character. But I do agree with what he says, and I kind of agree with what Tom Hardy says, that, you create something that's totally artificial, but it can generate a kind of reality that can enhance your life. Now, I had a really big sort of psychotherapeutic breakthrough, and I write about this in the book as well, when a psychotherapist of mine said, "Hey, man, are there any movie actors you really like?" I said, "Well, yeah." I listed some. He goes, "Well, why don't you try to be like that guy, in the next stressful situation and just see what it's like?" He used the cliche, fake it till you make it, but he tried to give it a more kind of profound meaning. And I could talk a little more about the kind of psychotherapeutic value of some of these ideas.
I would love to. I mean, I'd love to get into that because I think, something I've struggled with, depression, that I've written about on the site. And when I was reading this, like, this could be really powerful and helping people deal with things like depression, anxiety, or just hardship in general in life?
Well, this is one of the main reasons I wrote the book, is because these ideas have been so important for me in dealing with my clinical depression. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and soon after my daughter was born, she's now 13, I fell into a really, really, really deep suicidal depression. And I've been depressed before, but I'd kind of propped myself up by doing what I was very success oriented. I was kind of a workaholic. I was working all the time. I was also drinking a lot of alcohol. And suddenly my child's here, and if I'm going to be a decent father, I can't work as much, nor can I drink as much. And it's like all those props were kind of stripped away, and I was just there. Oh my gosh, my life is nothing. It's meaningless. So I started seeking psychotherapy, and I saw several psychotherapists. Didn't have much success. Saw some psychiatrists. Took several antidepressants. Didn't have much success. Yeah, but finally, when my daughter was about 3, 4 years old, thereabouts, I did find a good psychiatrist who gave me a good kind of melange of medications, and also said, go see this psychotherapist. He's really good. So I go see him, and really from the very beginning, he's very much about that if you're depressed, it's because you've trapped yourself in a narrative that doesn't empower you, that takes away your freedom. And he said to me, look, you've made this bipolar disorder the kind of controller of your life. You've made yourself a victim of it. So you can say things like, well, I can't be a good father because I'm bipolar, or I can't be a good husband because I'm bipolar. And he said, in doing that, you're making your bipolar disorder a kind of tyrant, controlling your life and taking away your power to change. And you're kind of enjoying that victimhood because it takes away responsibility. You don't have to take responsibility for being, say, a bad father, bad husband. He said, you got to change your narrative. Reinterpret this bipolar disorder. Think about it in a fresh way. Put it in a different kind of narrative. And he said, your assignment is to, go home and write a new narrative of your life, a novel, as it were, with yourself as a main character, thinking about your bipolar disorder in a new way. So we sort of started working in that way. And finally, what I decided was, as a father, that I probably wasn't going to be a good traditional father, a father with a big F who could be all authoritative and wise. I was just kind of good at being silly and stupid and idiotic, and I was really good at making my daughter laugh. So what I did is I self-consciously created a persona. I will be crazy dad. I won't be good parent. I'll be crazy dad. So I just really tried to be as ridiculous as possible, and my main goal in life was to make her laugh. She's 4 years old. And that created a new way of us relating to each other. We started having fun together, and I connected with her in new ways. And again, that led to, sort of deeper, more valuable ways of connecting beyond crazy dad. But the point is that this fiction making had really powerful psychotherapeutic value for me. I mean, in some ways, it's very much akin to cognitive behaviorist therapy, the idea that psychotherapy should not so much be going deeply within as Jung and Freud might have you do, but rather just create new habits and try to follow through on those new habits. Do something 5 times a week, and eventually it will stick. In other words, you're trying out new stories, and you want to kind of live into those new stories. So for me, these ideas aren't just philosophical. They aren't just, I guess, psychologically interesting. I mean, they're really kind of existentially powerful for me. And without them, I don't know where I would be.
Yeah, I love that idea, because when you tell it, like, for example, when you tell a depressed person, like, be yourself, like, depressed person, well, myself sucks. Like, I don't want to be myself. Like,
exactly.
Terrible advice. So yeah, the idea is like, well, create a new self. That's so much empowering, so much more empowering.
It was so liberating for me because I've been through a lot of more traditional psychotherapy, which is, I'm not discounting that, but, just sort of, recalling the past, thinking about how the past has affected the present, perhaps thinking about past traumas. That can be useful, but it wasn't working for me, I guess, because I'm kind of overly introspective anyway, and I'm kind of narcissistic. So I kind of got off on this endless navel gazing, but it never led to any change. But this more kind of outwardly directed psychotherapy did. I mean, I still struggle. I'm not healed by any stretch of the imagination. I still struggle mightily with depression. But I feel like I have a kind of toolkit now, which is more helpful than some of those earlier tools were.
I love this. So basically sum up here, because I think we've gone to some big picture things, but I love how you said, like, this is really it's an existential tool that you can use to have a more flourishing life, as Aristotle would say. Basically, the idea is there is no authentic self to be found. You are the creator of that self, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying in the book. Absolutely.
Create yourself. And so just go out there and create the best, like whatever you want to be, create it within limits. You can't do anything too out of the ordinary, but you can create something better for yourself if you want to.
Well, yes, that's exactly it. You know, and I've had people talk to me who have had, you know, very serious illnesses, and they've said things like, you know, I realized when I had cancer, I could say, I'm the guy who has cancer who might die. Or I can say, oh, I have cancer, but I'm also this and this and this and this and this, right? I mean, it's how you respond to what is given to you. And that's where the fiction making comes in. That's where the interpretation comes in. That's where the creation comes in. So absolutely. And I would say, you know, create a self that, you know, opens you to the world, that makes the world more heterogeneous to you, that gives you more opportunity to connect with as many other people, which means as many other narratives as possible. You know, if you create a kind of narrow narrative, you're going to be isolated and lonely and sad.
Great. Well, keep it fake. I love this. Eric Wilson, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. I really enjoyed this conversation, Brett.
Our guest today was Eric Wilson. He's the author of the book, Keep It Fake, Inventing an Authentic Life, and you can find that on Amazon.com. Well, that wraps up another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. For more manly tips and advice, make sure to check out the Art of Manliness website at artofmanliness.com. And if you enjoy this podcast and you feel like you're getting something out of it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. That'd help us get some constructive feedback on how we can improve the show, as well as get the word out about the podcast. And the best compliment you could give me is to recommend the podcast to your friends. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you for your continued support of the Art of Manliness podcast, as well as the site. And until next time, this is Brett McKay telling you to stay manly.